I'm Roger Baker, Executive Director of the Stratfor Center for Applied Geopolitics at RANE, a global center of excellence for geopolitical intelligence and analysis. Learn how you can put geopolitics to work for your organization at ranenetwork.com.
Welcome to RANE's Essential Geopolitics podcast. I'm Emma Kami, and I'm here today with RANE's Eurasia analyst, Matthew Orr. Initially, we were going to discuss the Wagner Group's influence in Belarus, but with the reports from earlier today that the Wagner head, Yevgeny Prigozhin, was among the passengers in a fatal plane crash, we will be discussing what we know about the crash in addition to the developing geopolitical tensions in Belarus. Welcome to the podcast, Matthew, and thanks for adjusting the topic on such short notice.
Hey, Emma, it's a pleasure to be here.
So to start us off, reports indicate that Wagner head Yevgeny Prigozhin and his top deputy Dmitry Utkin died in a plane crash. What do we know, and what are the implications of this for Russia?
Yeah, so we're speaking on Wednesday afternoon, the 23rd, and what we know at this time is that an aircraft linked to Prigozhin and the Wagner Group went down in Russia's Tver region. It was on the manifest. It was completing a flight from Moscow to St. Petersburg, which is a very common flight for Prigozhin to be taking. And videos from the scene shown the airplane falling almost certainly after some sort of explosion had taken place by it. There were some claims that it was shot down by anti-air systems, but a look at a lot of the wreckage, at least now, doesn't really look like that's the most likely scenario. It appears somewhat more likely that most likely a bomb on board exploded, and that's what caused the plane to go down. The dispatchers, the aircraft controllers, didn't receive any notifications about issues with the aircraft before the incident happened, so that would suggest that whatever happened was quite sudden, which would fit with it being some sort of a bomb on board. That's what we know right now. Of course, Prigozhin's death has not been confirmed. Multiple Russian authorities have said that he was scheduled to be on this plane. He was on the manifest, etc. But that, of course, doesn't mean that there wasn't some way that he could have not, for example, made it onto another aircraft that was also linked to Wagner, that also left from the same airfield and was also in the air when the incident happened, and then that other aircraft actually turned back to Moscow. But as the time of our speaking, it looks most likely that Prigozhin is dead. And honestly, no matter whether or not Prigozhin is actually dead, it's a quite apropos moment to begin having a discussion about what his death would mean for Russia, the implications of that, because it's clear that this entire topic of the Wagner mutiny, this saga that's been going on for months now, hadn't ended, and now this is a clear kind of step towards some sort of a resolution of that incident. I think it's clear that while this will prompt all kinds of backlash domestically within Russia, there's a lot of people, in particularly this far right milieu in Russia, against still within certain military circles, that was quite sympathetic to Prigozhin, sympathetic to the arguments that he was making, disdainful of the conduct of the war in Ukraine, etc. And there will be a lot of people who will be not only angry about his death in the abstract, but angry at this apparent demonstrative assassination, presumably, of Prigozhin by the Russian security services as a way of establishing deterrence, reestablishing clear control of Russia after Prigozhin had been able to launch this mutiny. And according to Russian commentators, foreign commentators, and regular people, there was very much the appearance that this guy had gotten off somewhat scot-free, and so that's why I had long believed that this was not the end of this saga, and that he was in danger, and that appears to have come to fruition. We said in our analyses that the Kremlin will not follow any so-called alleged agreements, gentlemen's agreements, etc., with Prigozhin, and will do so only insofar as it suits their interests, right? And so they likely believe that Prigozhin either wasn't following his end of the bargain, or that his further life wasn't needed to the Kremlin, and so they moved to remove him and show that there's an extremely high price for opposing the Kremlin. At the same time, remember, there had been other far right bloggers in Russia that had been sentenced to jail time recently, and there was renewed repressions, and also in the military, the general who was very close to the Wagner Group and formerly in charge of the special military operation, Sergei Surovikin, had been removed from his post and had been under house arrest, and so on and so forth. And so it seemed very strange in light in all of this that the individual who had chosen to initiate all of these events that are not particularly desired by the Kremlin would somehow get off scot-free. So it makes sense that this would happen, and it makes sense that it would happen in such a demonstrable manner.
Well, yeah, thanks for that analysis. And I mean, based off of what we know, I guess, and kind of connecting it back to the topic that we were going to discuss, Belarus has been in the headlines recently due to the Wagner Group's deployment of around 4,000 fighters there, and Lithuania's subsequent closure of border crossings with Belarus. Is the concern over Wagner in Belarus justified, and does this reported death of Prigozhin influence it at all? And what is Lukashenko trying to accomplish?
Yeah, great question. Right, the most immediate thing that comes to mind when thinking about the consequences of this is that what remains, again, the Wagner Group, compared to its highs sometime last year, is maybe only about a tenth of its former size, roughly, very roughly. But what's left of their fighters, a decent portion of them are in Belarus, as has been much publicized, something like 4,000. Some estimates put it closer to 6,000. But yeah, you have this contingent of forces now in Belarus who, in the first place, didn't have much to be doing. Right? They claimed that they were training Belarusian soldiers, but you can only do that for so long, and there's only so much utility that the influence of these Wagner people can have that's positive on the Belarusians. And so now, there's this question of what's going to happen to these forces. The most immediate concern is that these Wagner personnel may be dissatisfied or angered by this news, and it's not clear what they're going to do. And with regards to that, I think that's going to be a problem, but I don't think that we should anticipate particularly a decisive action by these forces. In fact, a lot of indications are that following this, it's clear who has the stronger hand and what kind of signal is being sent, and so it may be that those Wagner forces are eventually quietly allowed to leave Belarus and actually go back to Russia. Of course, if they understand that they must behave well. The other reason for that is, of course, that Prigozhin's estate now presumably has to be in some sort of eventual state of being realized, and its assets assessed and redistributed and things like that. And it's not clear that the Belarusians may not have a reason or desire to want to pay for these Wagner forces to stay in Belarus. It's clear that Prigozhin had started talking about this new path for Wagner in Africa. In fact, just a day before, or a couple days before his apparent death, he released a new recruitment video, essentially a recruitment video that appeared to be from Africa, kind of reasserting that the group would be focused on Africa. But those attempts and efforts seemed somewhat abortive, given that Wagner's status within the Russian Federation itself has remained under all kinds of pressure, and it's clear that they're not recruiting normally and operating normally, and their brand is being taken down, and things like that. And so their status was always somewhat unclear. But I think that the death of Prigozhin, I think it makes it somewhat less likely, in combination again with these other factors that you mentioned, like Lithuania's closure of these border checkpoints, the Poland's deployment of more forces to the region. I think it makes it less likely that we're going to see these Wagner forces want to engage in particularly serious provocations along NATO borders from Belarus. Just because, I mean, I think it's a further signal to them that, right, their organization, their leadership has been set up as sort of a scapegoat or a fall man, and they may not want to put themselves at risk for things like that.
Right. And as this is happening, Minsk is preparing for elections in early 2024. Can you expand on what these elections are and if they have any significance with everything else that's going on?
Yeah, absolutely. We often, I think over the past couple years, we've let Belarusian politics fall to the back burner. I think that was correct. And early next year, we actually have the first electoral event that at least has some chance of having any significance. There was a referendum last year that changed the country's constitution and created this organization called the All Belarusian People's Assembly. It's basically an extra parliamentary body from constitutional law terms, but it actually was imbued with some potentially significant functions under this new constitution, where it's basically supposed to, create a general policy course for the Belarusian state and government that then the other institutions, namely the president and so on, et cetera, are supposed to follow. So Belarus has a regular election in February, which is an election for the country's parliament, and a local election, and also an election, I believe, for this All Belarusian People's Assembly. And then within a matter of months, by around April of 2024, Belarus is supposed to actually have a meeting, the first ever meeting of this body with its new constitutional powers. And so, yeah, this is just an instant that we're looking to see if we can glean any kind of perception of what Belarus's future is going to look like based off of this body. The two main things we're looking at are, first and foremost, integration with Russia, right? Which ties intimately in with everything that we've just been talking about, right? Where if there's instability in Russia, if there's if Putin is actually gaining authority, increasing his position, removing alternative power centers, that might actually increase Russia's ability and boldness to want to bring Belarus decisively closer into its orbit. That's part of Russia's general plan, which is something that we've covered a lot on our worldview service. But yeah, in general, this this election is going to also give us a perception on what Lukashenko is thinking about his ultimate succession process. There's been talk about him being in somewhat poor health. That's been confirmed by video evidence and him being seen in bandages and not being able to walk places and things like that. And he's seen what's happened in a lot of these post-Soviet successions, or in some cases non-successions. If you look at Putin and basically the inability for office holders to reliably leave office and stay in power and stay safe, etc. But on the other hand, he wants to pass off power before his health could potentially suddenly or unexpectedly deteriorate further. And so we're also looking to see if the All Belarusian People's Assembly provides us any new information about how Lukashenko is thinking about how a potential succession might go, when it might start, etc., things like that. And of course, it's the Belarusian opposition, which has been heavily repressed since mass protests erupted in Belarus in 2020, and it has essentially been forced entirely abroad and underground for those who still remain in Belarus. And so they're also the ones really looking at these 2024 elections as a way to try to at least somehow, some way, gain greater influence over what's happening in Belarus. But unfortunately, it doesn't look like that there's going to be a clear avenue for them to return to protests or to influence these processes in any meaningful way. But yeah, it definitely will be interesting to see if, for example, Wagner forces really will stay around until the time of that election. because Lukashenko in the past has reacted very negatively to having private military companies on Belarusian territory, and particularly during the time of an election. There was actually a famous incident related to this prior to the chaotic 2020 election in Belarus. And so, yeah, I think that everything that's happening with Prigozhin just adds another layer of uncertainty that I don't think either Lukashenko or Putin necessarily entirely know the consequences of. Although at this time there's no indication that Prigozhin's death will lead to greater instability either in Russia or in Belarus.
Well, thanks so much, Matthew. I'm sure we'll be hearing more from you about the circumstances surrounding the crash and geopolitical developments in Belarus as elections approach and as they relate to what happened with Prigozhin. So thanks for your time. For more geopolitical and economic analyses like this, subscribe to our geopolitical intelligence product, RANE Worldview. Our flagship risk intelligence products provide clients with access to the insights and analyses they need to make more informed decisions and drive better risk management outcomes. Sign up at ranenetwork.com. That's RANE network.com. I'm Emma Kami. Thanks for listening.